Rebecca had lived in a state of fear for the last 3 weeks, and her parents were getting really worried about it. As she walked through the crowded halls of James Marvin Middle School, bumping into others as she tried to stay in the moment, she suddenly knew that today would be the day that it all happened. Today would be the last day she ever saw her family, said hi to her school friends, and basked in the Ohio sun again. It had all started with dreams. Rebecca had been plagued with dreams since she was young, but they hadn't started to scare her, not until recently. Normally her dreams were about vague things, cars or candy bars or songs on the radio, but Rebecca had noticed that they almost always came true. She'd seen the Nintendo DS that her parents had gotten her for her birthday a few years ago, something that had set her dad off when she didn't act absolutely surprised. She'd seen the surprise algebra quiz that she was going to fail and studied on the bus so she could manage a C. She'd seen the car that was going to hit Lacey Summers, but hadn't been quick enough to stop that one, and that was just the tip of the iceberg. Rebecca saw all kinds of things, but it wasn't until last year in history class that she finally had a name for it. After a unit on Greek mythology, Rebecca had heard the sad story of Cassandra and how her premonitions had been correct, but ignored. After that, she always thought of the dreams as Cassandra dreams, but they weren't just dreams anymore. Rebecca started having them while she was awake about 3 weeks ago, and they scared the hell out of her. She'd been sitting in history class, reading a book as she waited for the bell. It was the end of the day, and she was looking forward to talking with her friends and maybe playing something on her computer. She'd just turned a page, reading over the adventures in Westeros for the 3rd or 4th time, when everything went white. It was like being caught in one of those flash grenades, and as Rebecca fell sideways out of her desk, she heard people calling her name. Suddenly she hadn't been in 7th period history class, but in a cold, dark place she was unfamiliar with. She couldn't move her arms, and when she looked down, she saw they were strapped down with thick bands. She was in a hospital, but it wasn't like any hospital she'd ever seen before. It was so sterile, so cold, and the only light to be seen was a small overhead lamp on the desk. Rebecca lay back, looking at the unfamiliar ceiling, and waiting for what would come next. Suddenly the room was invaded by a blade of light, and the shadow it carried fell across the bed. A man walked in. He was tall, his hair in a tight crew cut, and his fatigue pants made her think he might be a soldier. He stepped right up to the side of her bed, and his fingers had suddenly become needles. They were huge and glistening in the knife's edge of light, and the liquid slid down them in fat drops. As he prepared to plunge them in, he mouthed something that she couldn't hear. When she woke up, she was in the nurse's office, and the space was as different as the one she had left as night was today. "Feeling better, sweetie?" the nurse asked. "You gave us a little scare there." The nurse said she believed Rebecca had experienced a seizure, but her doctors could find no reason for it when her mother rushed her to her pediatrician. Possibly stress-related. I imagine going from elementary to middle school is a big transition. If it happens again, Mom, make sure to bring her back in. Until then, get plenty of rest and maybe cut back on the caffeine some. It had happened 5 more times since then, but Rebecca had kept it to herself. She didn't think she was having a seizure. She thought she was having waking Cassandra dreams. "Becca, are you okay?" Rebecca looked up, trying to force the duality of her vision to coalesce into something normal. She saw Darlene looking at her with real worry. Darlene wouldn't understand this, but Rebecca was glad that someone familiar was there to ground her. First time it had happened had been scary, but after that, Rebecca had managed to get it somewhat under control. She still had to wait for it to pass, closing her eyes and trying not to get dizzy, which would make her throw up, but it got a little easier to handle every time. As her vision finally cleared, the dual perspective settled into the present again. She sighed and leaned against the lockers for a minute before answering. "Fine, Darlene, it's just a little headache." "Becca, you aren't taking drugs, are you?" Rebecca almost laughed, but had to remind herself that Darlene was serious, as well as legitimately worried about her. Darlene and her other friends, Susan and Mary, had been talking about her a lot when they thought she wasn't listening. Never anything bad, but they still discussed her like she wasn't there. They'd noticed how different she'd become in just the last few weeks, and in Darlene's mind, that could only lead back to one of the after-school staples like drugs or alcohol or strangers. "'Cause I saw an after-school special thing at church, and you look like you're going through what the girl was going through when she was on drugs, as, she went through it, and I'm worried about you." It's not drugs," Rebecca assured her, straightening up as she got herself under control. "I've been having these really bad headaches for a while, but I think they're starting to pass." It's not your monthlies, is it?" Darlene asked, pitching her voice low. Darlene always talked about her periods like an old woman, trying not to offend anyone's sensibilities. "Definitely not," Rebecca said. "Do you need to go to the nurse's office?" Darlene asked, but as the second bell rang, Rebecca got a less violent jolt of intuition. "No, but I think I'm going to miss third period." "How come?" Darlene asked, sounding hurt. Math was the only period the girls had together this year, and Rebecca thought it reminded Darlene of the 5 years of classes they'd had in elementary school together. Rebecca was about to say she didn't know, but about that time the tone sounded overhead. "Rebecca Daniels to the principal's office. Again, Rebecca Daniels to the principal's office ASAP," Miss Taylor called over the crunchy static of the ancient speakers. Darlene looked at her mystified. "Spooky," she whispered, and Rebecca couldn't help but laugh at the silly face Darlene always made to go along with it. Despite the stressful few weeks she had experienced, Rebecca could always count on Darlene for a good laugh sometimes. Conrad drummed his fingers on his leg as he sat in the old model sedan across the street from the middle school. He always felt like a creep when he had to take these kinds of jobs, and he expected Chris Hansen to tap on his window at any minute and asked what he thought he was doing. He glanced over at Kyrie, who was scrolling on her phone, and even from here he could see the colorful layout of Instagram. She could sit there for hours on end, just scrolling through different stories, and it amazed Conrad that she never ran out of things to take in. "How do you do that?" he asked, suddenly unable to stand it anymore. Kyrie looked up from her phone and raised one of her artfully done eyebrows questioningly. "Do what?" "Scroll on your phone all day. Isn't it boring? Don't you run out of whatever after a while?" Kyrie shrugged. "I don't know. It's just doom scrolling. Mindless consumption of media. What do you do on your phone? I don't think I've ever even seen it." Conrad reached into his pocket and pulled out a little silver flip phone. "Make calls." Kyrie looked at the little gray box with real amusement. "No way! You work for one of the most advanced military organizations on the planet, and you carry that dinosaur around in your pocket? How do you live?" Conrad shrugged. "Offline, I guess. Just never saw the point of having something like that. All we had overseas were sat phones, and all you can do on them is make calls." Kyrie laughed. "After this, we are totally taking you somewhere so you can join the 21st century. Maybe we'll stop at a museum so you can drop off that relic for some antiquities exhibit, too." She went back to her doom scrolling, as she called it, and Conrad sat back as he watched over the front of the school. This was the boring part, the surveillance before the snatch. But it was necessary. If the plan fell through, they might very well have to grab her off the street, and for that, they would need to know her habits. Did she walk? Did she bike? Did she often stop at a friend's house? This was all data that would need to be compiled, but there was another reason they were staying so close. Ridley had made it pretty clear that she wouldn't need to be snatched if everything went to plan. "Rebecca Daniels isn't our first future seer. If we can put possible futures in her way, something horrific that could happen, her abilities will pick up on it and warn her of the potential threat. The longer you stay within the proximity of the girl, the more likely her early warning system will focus on this. The more she's warned, the more she'll hyperfixate. The more she hyperfixates, the more manic she'll become. The more manic she becomes, the more her anxiety will look like insanity, and the easier it will be to pluck her up from some facility once she's Baker-acted or institutionalized. There's no need to snatch someone and risk public interference when so many of these facilities are in our pockets already. Conrad liked the old ghoul well enough, but when he started talking like that, it always made Conrad a little worried about his mental stability. It didn't have to be this way, he reflected as he squirmed in his seat to stop the pins and needles that were shooting up his buttocks. Conrad and Kyrie, Representatives Marvin Lancaster and Marcy Chin from Dartmouth College, had sat in the Daniels' living room and had a very similar meeting to the one that Masha's parents had had. Conrad, Marvin, had told them how gifted their daughter was and how they wanted to extend her a place in their program for gifted young people. Her tuition would be covered by the state, and the possibilities after graduation from a program like this would be boundless. The Daniels, however, were not MIT grads. Mrs. Daniels was a sometime substitute teacher and full-time homemaker. Her husband was a mechanic for one of the local outfits, and neither had so much as stepped into a college campus, let alone graduated one. The Daniels were pedigree white trash from the Northeast, and how either had managed to spawn the girl they were now hunting for was beyond him. They had been mistrustful of the pair from the moment they'd opened the door to find them on their doorstep, and had declined their offer without asking their daughter's opinion. Rebecca ain't going to no liberal college so she can come back with a head full of ideas and a lack of godliness. I'd suggest you two leave, her father had groused at them, and Conrad and Kyrie had apologized for wasting their time. They had planned to snatch her that very week, but when Ridley had suggested this alternative, Conrad had been receptive. Now they were sitting here for God knew how long, waiting for this 11-year-old girl to have a nervous breakdown. Conrad sighed as the bell rang, and students hustled to make their class before it stopped. At least the pay was good, he reflected, as he wiped a hand over his camo pants. Rebecca came into the principal's office to find someone unexpected waiting for her. She had been seeing Dr. Hammarskjöld for about a year now, and when she saw the funny little man perched behind the intimidating desk that her principal favored, she couldn't help but laugh. It wasn't the first time he had come to check up on her after a particularly heavy session, and as he pushed out of Principal Vine's chair and came around the desk, Rebecca found that the visions were the farthest thing from her mind. He leaned against the desk, his head just visible over the lip, and he looked for all the world like a shrunken Mr. Rogers. "Miss Daniels, I got a call from your mother this morning to let me know you've had a particularly awful dream last night, so I thought I might come and check on you. So, how are you today?" Rebecca opened her mouth to tell him about the waking dream she'd had only moments before, but quashed it. Dr. Hammarskjöld knew about the Cassandra's dreams, but she hadn't quite dared to tell him about the waking ones. The one last night had been no worse than any other, but it had begun in the midst of a dream that had been pretty good up until then. The switch from her usual nonsensical dreamscape to the harsh sterility of her visions had been extremely jarring, and she'd woken up her parents when she started screaming. She was ashamed now that she realized she had inconvenienced Dr. Hammarskjöld and taken him away from his other patients. It was nothing. It was just... She hesitated, trying to find a lie, but he guessed it. It was the hospital dreams again, wasn't it? Rebecca bit her lip, nodding as she hung her head. "Have you identified the man from your dreams? Is he a relative, maybe? Someone from your past, perhaps?" he asked, taking a much smaller seat from beside the desk where he'd hidden it. "I don't know, but it almost seems like I should know him. How can I not? He haunts my dreams. He's never far from my mind. I feel like every time I see him, I'm a little closer to going crazy." The little man smiled, and that childish grin was enough to put Rebecca at ease. Her parents had been skeptical when a family friend told them about Dr. Hammarskjöld, but he'd proven to be the one respite in Rebecca's often uncertain world. He had been very interested in her dreams, especially the ones that focused on this mystery man, and considered the frequency with which they came true to be more than coincidence. Rebecca wasn't sure that she would have stayed sane this long without him, and he'd been a great help in her recovery.
Rebecca, you may have to entertain the idea that this man is simply a manifestation of your own fears. You may never see him in the flesh, and that may be a good thing. I want to schedule an appointment this afternoon with your mother. Would that be okay? I'd like to talk about the frequency of these dreams, and I'd like you to be honest with me this time. I know they've been happening more often than you've been telling me.
Rebecca looked away, not wanting to hurt the little doctor's feelings by letting him know that she had lied to him.
Yes, sir, I will.
His phone vibrated then, and he looked at the message before punching in a response with his stubby fingers. It always looked so weird to see him type on a regular-sized phone, and Rebecca tried not to laugh. Dr. Hammarskjöld was very open about his dwarfism, but Rebecca still tried her best not to make him feel self-conscious. He'd been so wonderful to her, such a help in her time of need, and she didn't want to repay him with insults or belittlement.
Now, before you head back to class, I'd like to put you in a peaceful state so that you can focus on the rest of your day and not be distracted by visions. Would that help?
Rebecca nodded, holding her hands out to him instinctively. Dr. Hammarskjöld had a thing that he did where he put a patient in a state of peaceful relaxation, and Rebecca always felt better after one of these sessions. Afterwards, her mind was always more focused, less affected by the visions, and she usually slept well the night after one. She had a test coming up last period, and if she could focus enough to pass it, the day might not be a total loss.
Okay, he said, taking her hands and closing his eyes. Now I want you to count back from 10 for me. Once you reach 10, we may begin.
Rebecca closed her eyes, waiting for the magic to happen.
Once you reach 9, you'll enter a relaxed state of mind.
His voice took on a dreamy quality as he spoke, and Rebecca felt his thumbs making circles on her palms.
Once you reach 8, you'll be feeling great.
His voice settled over her like a warm blanket, and Rebecca found that she did feel great.
Once you reach 7, you'll be floating in heaven.
Her body did feel lighter, less substantial, more at ease.
Once you reach 6, there'll be no conflicts.
Rebecca yawned, wanting to cover it, but unable.
Once you reach 5, your problems take a dive.
Rebecca felt like she could drift off to sleep, right here.
Once you reach 4, it's time to snore.
Rebecca did feel herself nodding off.
Once you reach 3, you'll find your reprieve.
Rebecca tried not to fall asleep, but it was inevitable.
Once you reach 2, it's all up to you.
Rebecca lay back a little, her hands slipping out of Dr. Hammarskjöld's.
Once you reach 1, it's over and done.
Rebecca was snoring softly in her chair, her peaceful slumber unbroken by thoughts.
Now, Rebecca, you will sleep for the next 10 minutes and awake refreshed and ready for whatever the afternoon may bring.
Rebecca nodded sleepily, but it was more of a reflex than anything. She was already dreaming of someplace other than the sterile hospital. The silver flip phone rang, and Conrad had barely answered it when Security Chief Ridley shouted for him to go in the school right this very second.
What? Get the girl? It's the middle of the day, sir. We would definitely be... No, listen closely, because I don't have time to explain.
Conrad listened, understood, took off his seatbelt, and opened the car door.
Understood, sir. I won't let you down.
I never had a doubt, he said, hanging up as Conrad snapped the phone closed.
Where are you going? Kyrie asked, starting to get out too. Stay in the car. I'll be right back.
Kyrie shrugged as she slid over to the driver's seat, her phone back up as she explored the depths of Instagram. She had just found a really cute cat video that she hadn't seen before, and she wasn't about to miss that. Rebecca awoke slowly, her eyelids fluttering as she looked around the room. She'd fallen asleep in the principal's office? Had she had another incident like before? She hoped not. It was always embarrassing to have them happen at school. As the memories of what had happened slowly came back, she heard the sound of someone texting, and looked up to see Dr. Hammarskjöld sitting not too far away. He smiled as he noticed she had awoken, putting his phone away as he got up. "I trust you had a nice rest." "I did. Thank you, Doctor. It was just what I needed." "I'm glad I could help. Now let's get you back to class. Can't help with failing grades like I can bad dreams," Dr. Hammarskjöld tittered. The principal looked up as they exited, his large brush mustache twitching as he got up from the reception area. He clearly didn't like being kicked out of his own office, but he took it in stride since Dr. Hammarskjöld had likely explained it was for a good cause. He went to speak with the little doctor, the man thanking him for his kindness. Dr. Hammarskjöld had taken out his cell phone, the principal stepping back into his office, and as Dr. Hammarskjöld began to speak to her mother, Rebecca said that she would see him later, and headed for the door back to school. When the man walked through the door she was about to exit, smiling at her as he directed himself towards the checkout desk, Rebecca felt all the peace dribble out of her. It was him! It was him! It was him! The man looked at her strangely as she began to hyperventilate. Rebecca was backpedaling, falling on her backside as she crab-walked away from the man. She couldn't breathe. Her breath was coming out in big gasps, but it didn't seem to be helping when it came back in. The man was saying something, calling for help or something, but Rebecca couldn't hear him over the pounding in her ears. He was trying to help her, his hands coming out to touch her, and she pulled away violently as she scuttled backwards. The principal was coming out of his office, and Dr. Hammarskjöld was trying to calm him down, but it was impossible. She was drowning on her own breath, and when she fainted, it was almost a mercy. "She's had a bad shock," Dr. Hammarskjöld was telling her parents. "She's been having these strange dreams about a man who's trying to hurt her. I believe that she may have seen something in that man that she saw today that triggered her badly." Rebecca was laying on a hospital bed, her arms secured with scratchy straps. Her parents were in the hallway, her father holding her mother as she wept openly. They blamed themselves, it seemed. She had had a great aunt with schizophrenia, a cousin with autism, and they hadn't even bothered to have her tested for either. They had failed to get their daughter the proper help, aside from bringing her to Dr. Hammarskjöld, and now she was broken. Rebecca had heard it all from the bed, but hadn't said anything. It wouldn't be long now before it all came to pass, and saying anything would just stretch it out longer. "Is she in danger, Doctor?" her father asked, looking at the little man with a lot more respect than Rebecca had ever seen. Her father had always silently considered the man a quack, but his insurance had covered the bills, and that had seemed to help. Her father loved her, wouldn't have withheld anything from her if it meant that she could thrive, but he had grown up in an age of psychobabble and bad actors, and mental health looked to him like so much hokum. Now he knew better, though it was too late. "I think she might be. She was almost feral before she passed out. You heard her screams on the phone, Mrs. Daniels. I think that it might be best to institutionalize her for a time." "Institutionalize?" her mother wailed. No, not my little girl. She needs to be at home with her family." "That may not be wise, Mrs. Daniels. We don't know what might set her off, and if she hurts one of you, one of your other children even, it would be unthinkable. Something like that might facilitate the need for more punitive forms of institutionalization as well. Some of those facilities are little better than prisons, and at least if they send her to Mercy Home, I can continue to monitor her progress and be part of her therapy." "The doc knows best, Margaret," her father cut in, though more kindly than Rebecca had ever heard him. "How long would she be in here for?" "Hard to say," Dr. Hammarskjöld said. "I would say at least 90 days. If she shows improvement, then she might be able to come home after that. Otherwise," he looked at her sadly from the door of her room, "well, let's remain positive. You can visit her as well. Visits from friendly faces will surely help speed along her recovery." They discussed the particulars, but Rebecca knew it would amount to nothing. They would never visit her because after today she wouldn't be here. She'd be gone, spirited away to some strange and terrible fate. She wondered if Dr. Hammarskjöld knew this or not. She hoped not. She really did like the little man. He had been an island of reprieve in the sea of turbulence that her life had become recently, and she had looked forward to her sessions with him a lot.
"Very good," Dr. Hammarskjöld said, putting the paper her father had hastily signed into his briefcase. "I'll make the necessary arrangements to have her transferred to Mercy Home after she's cleared by the hospital. I know this is hard, but you really are doing what's best for your daughter." Her parents came in to say goodbye, kissing her on the cheek and telling her they'd see her soon. Rebecca said nothing, and when her father turned off the lights and closed the door to her room, she realized she was already in the dream room. The small desk lamp cast the sterile hell in nightmare tones, and Rebecca tried not to cry as she lay in the semi-darkness. Crying wouldn't be any good. The man would come whether she wept or not, and nothing was going to change that. She wondered how long she'd have to lay here, and as she replayed the dream again and again, she realized it didn't matter. He would come. That's all that mattered in the end. She kept thinking about what he was saying, trying to read his lips, and by the time she figured it out, the door was open, and the man she'd been waiting for was there. The clock said it was about 30 minutes since her parents had left, but it had felt like a lifetime. Rebecca supposed that it had been. The man in the fatigue pants had a needle in his hand, unlike the one in her dream. In the dream, they had sprouted from his fingers, but now she saw it was nothing but a plain old syringe. The tip still glistened with translucent fluid, but the fearful illusion was mostly broken. As he leaned over to inject the liquid into her arm, she said the words that he had only mouthed in her dream, and it brought him up short. "Nighty-night, princess." He stopped the needle inches from her arm and scowled. Nobody likes a wise-ass princess. The needle slid in, and Rebecca plummeted into a thankfully dreamless sleep. She woke up in a much worse nightmare than she had been living. She woke up in the kindergarten to the sound of a little girl crying for her mother. Dr. Nathan Hammarskjöld was leaving the hospital when his phone rang. He looked down at the screen and considered not answering it. It had been a stressful day, and he really did not want to talk to the man who'd exacerbated most of it. He knew, however, that not answering would bring him even more stress, and he picked it up as he stepped into the mop closet so he wouldn't be overheard. "Yes?" The line was quiet for a moment before the living corpse of his nightmares began to speak. "Is that how you speak to me, Nathan, the man who made you everything you are today?" Nathan wanted to tell the man exactly how he wanted to speak with him, but he bit his lip and gave the old corpse what he wanted. "No, sir. How can I help you?" "That's better. Just wanted to let you know that your bonus for helping with the extraction will be in your account before the end of the day." Nathan waited for the other shoe to drop, not taking the bait as he waited for the man to tell him why he had really called. "I also wanted to tell you that we'll be calling you back to the kindergarten for this year's class." There it was. "I appreciate the opportunity, but I'm afraid I must decline. I have far too much going on with my practice to—" "Oh, Nathan, you must have misunderstood. I wasn't asking. I wasn't inviting you to come teach a course. I was telling you to waddle your diminutive ass home. Now see here, I'm not one of your puppets that you can yank back to the stage when you feel like it. I am a doctor with a PhD in psychology and a minor in child development. I studied at Johns Hopkins, for Christ's sake, and I will not be bullied by you anymore." There was dead air for the stretch of about 10 seconds, and every second saw a little more air run out of the doctor's sails. "You will come home. You will assist us with this year's cycle, and in return, I will forget that you ever spoke to me in such a way, Nathan. You owe that PhD to this institute, as well as your life. Have you forgotten how I plucked you out of that orphanage? How I saved you from a freak show or as a life as a subject of outrage and ridicule? Have you forgotten how I let you keep your ridiculous little powers when the rest of your class was burnt out and washed out? Every day that you breathed the air without pain, is a day that you should fall on your knees and thank God for the existence of your betters, Nathan. I will see you in 3 days, or you'd had better hope I never see you again." He hung up the phone, and Nathan was left shaking in the broom closet. His phone made a satisfying splash as he threw it into the mop bucket, but it was a tantrum that ultimately gained him nothing. Unlike most of the kindergarten washouts, Nathan hated the things they made him do. He'd become a doctor to help people, not to sacrifice children before the altar of this clandestine organization. He hadn't wanted to help with Rebecca Daniels, but Ridley had made it clear that he didn't have much of a choice. It was either Rebecca, or Ridley would expose him for what he was, and Nathan couldn't have that. He seethed in the closet as he fished his phone out of the mop bucket. It appeared that even now he was little more than a fool, meant only to caper for Security Chief Ridley.
"You're still here. I thought you might be. Thanks for joining me for tonight's story. If your insatiable appetite for horror knows no bounds, might I suggest one of our playlists, or one of our previous stories in the archive? There should be one appearing at the end of the story any minute now. And of course, if you're not subscribed, why not go ahead and hit that subscribe button? Maybe hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of the spooky things that we do here. If you prefer your horror a little more analog, you can always pick up one of my books. There's a link below to my latest, and it'll take you to all the great things that I've posted on Amazon. For my book lovers in the audience, I always suggest coming on down to Patreon so you can become part of my ghostly reader tier and get a book anytime I write one, which is usually about twice a year. Speaking of my patrons, let's go ahead and thank them, shall we? Thanks to Unicorn Hollow for being our spooky ghost contributor. Thanks to Janet and Lady Vengeance for being our spooky skeleton tier contributors. Thanks to Hi Stacy, Winter, Xaronan, Emily Coltsfoot, Stephanie Carrington, Marianne Schuler, Tyler Parker, and Jennifer Damron for being our ghostly reader tier contributors. Thanks, everyone. We just couldn't do the show without you. If you think you might like to support the show in a more monetary fashion, come on down to Patreon. I have many tiers. I'm sure you'll find one that suits you best. I always recommend the Ghostly Reader tier, since you get a signed book anytime I write one on your doorstep. But I have many tiers, and again, I'm sure you'll find one to suit you. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.